When we think about a crime, we usually picture the physical act, right? The deed itself. But in the eyes of the law, that's really only half the story. What was actually going on inside a person's head, their state of mind, is often just as important, if not more so. So, what's the line that separates a tragic accident from a criminal act? How does the law decide who's to blame, and maybe even more importantly, how much blame they deserve? That's the huge question we're going to unpack today.
Well, it all comes down to a legal concept called mens rea. It's a Latin term, and it literally means guilty mind. It's this core idea that for most serious crimes, you can't just have the criminal act, you also need a criminal mental state to go along with it. Now, to get our heads around this, we're going to use this as our guide, the mountain of culpability. Think of it as a map of blameworthiness. Right at the very top, at the peak, you've got intention. That's the most blameworthy state of mind. And as we work our way down through recklessness and other states, all the way to the bottom, the level of blame gets lower and lower. This is going to be our roadmap for this explainer.
Okay, so what does the law actually mean by a guilty mind? It's not as simple as just having bad thoughts. It's about very specific, legally defined mental states. Let's break it down with a super simple example. You're in a supermarket, you pick up an apple because you're going to buy it. Totally fine, obviously. But what if you pick up that exact same apple, but your plan is to steal it? Well, now you've committed a crime. The physical act is identical. The only thing that changed was what was going on in your head, your mens rea. All right, let's start our climb at the very top of the mountain. We're talking about the highest, most culpable form of mens rea there is. Criminal intention. So here we are, right at the summit. Intention. This is the mental state the prosecution has to prove for the most serious crimes out there, like murder. To get a murder conviction, they have to show that the defendant actually intended to kill, or at the very least cause really serious harm. But here's the thing. Intention isn't just one simple idea. The law actually splits it into two. First, you have direct intent. That's the easy one. It's your goal, your aim, your purpose. You want something to happen, and you act to make it happen. But then there's oblique intent, and this is where it gets a little trickier. This covers the side effects, the things you didn't necessarily want to happen, but you knew were pretty much guaranteed to happen because of your actions. And this is the absolute key. The legal test here, set by some really important cases, is incredibly high. For it to be oblique intent, the outcome can't just be likely, or even very likely. The jury has to be convinced that the defendant saw that result as a virtual certainty. And this idea was really put to the test in the tragic case of R versus Woolen. A father, in a moment of rage, threw his baby son, causing fatal injuries. Now, the prosecution never argued that he wanted to kill his child. The whole legal fight was about this. Did he have the oblique intent to cause serious harm? Did he see that terrible outcome as a virtual certainty of what he was doing? Here's a great way to think about it. Imagine you're going to kick a football at a tiny little target that's sitting right in front of a giant glass window. Your direct intent, your main goal, is to hit the target. But you're not stupid. You know that breaking that window is a virtually certain side effect. Well, in the eyes of the law, that means you also intend to break the window. Okay, let's start making our way down the mountain. We're leaving the peak of virtual certainty and we're entering the territory of risk-taking. We're talking about recklessness. So here we are, just one step down from the peak. Recklessness is considered less blameworthy than intention, but don't get me wrong, it's still very serious, and it's the mental element for a whole host of different crimes. It's all about taking a risk you knew you shouldn't have. So what exactly is recklessness? The key phrase here is conscious taking of an unjustified risk. See how we've moved from the virtual certainty of intention to the probability of harm? The defendant saw a risk, knew it was a bad idea, and just went for it anyway. Now, this is a really important distinction the law makes. To prove recklessness, the courts use what's called a subjective test. An objective test would ask, what would a normal, reasonable person have seen in this situation? But a subjective test is different. It asks, what was going through this specific defendant's head? Did they personally see the risk? And there's a famous case that just nails this point home. A man who was suffering from a mental illness lit a small fire inside a haystack just to try and stay warm. Of course, the whole thing went up in flames. Now, any reasonable person would have seen that risk a mile off. but the court found that because of his specific condition, he was incapable of seeing it, and because he didn't foresee the risk, he wasn't reckless. It's all about what was in his actual mind.
Okay, we're making our way to the very bottom of the mountain now, to the foundation. And this is where things get really interesting, because we find a whole category of crimes where the whole idea of a guilty mind basically just vanishes.
And here we are at the base. Now, we did skip over a level on the way down called negligence. That's basically when you fail to see a risk that a reasonable person would have. But right here, at the very bottom, we have something called strict liability. And for these crimes, what the defendant was thinking is completely and totally irrelevant. What this means is, for a strict liability crime, the prosecution doesn't have to prove any kind of guilty mind at all. No intention, no recklessness, nothing. The simple act of doing the thing is enough to make you guilty. It's a huge exception to the whole mens rea rule.
So why on earth would we have this exception? Well, it really boils down to public safety. In 2019 alone, 1,752 people were killed in road accidents in the UK. So to try and prevent that kind of harm, the law makes things like speeding a matter of strict liability. It doesn't matter if you meant to speed or you just weren't paying attention. To protect the public, the act itself is the crime.
So we've taken the whole journey, from the very peak of intention all the way down to the base of strict liability. Let's just zoom out for a second and talk about why these distinctions are so incredibly important.
Let's look at our mountain one last time. We've gone from the very top, intention, down through recklessness, past other standards like negligence, all the way to the foundation strict liability. We've seen how the law carves out these crucial distinctions based entirely on what was going on in a person's head and how it treats each level completely differently. And this isn't just academic. The stakes are absolutely massive. In a homicide case, for example, that line between foreseeing a virtual certainty, which is intention, and foreseeing a probability, which is recklessness, that's the line between a conviction for murder, which comes with a mandatory life sentence, and a conviction for manslaughter, where the judge gets to decide the sentence. So, the law has this really detailed framework for trying to judge a person's state of mind. It's the result of centuries of arguments and cases. It tries to draw these clear, neat lines to make sure the punishment really fits the crime. But the big question we're left with is, in the messy, complicated reality of human behavior, does it always get it right?